Like what you see here? Then be sure to subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8, a channel devoted to the history of college football. New videos drop twice a week. Click the card in the upper right corner or the link in the description to subscribe now. And now, on with our feature presentation.
A few weeks ago, I made a video about this man right here, Nolan Ryan, and his iconic no-hitter that he threw in 1991 for the Texas Rangers against the Toronto Blue Jays, as well as the bizarre broadcasting controversy involving ESPN that surrounded this game. If you want to learn more about that, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, as a brief synopsis, here was the controversy surrounding the game. Initially, ESPN was planning on showing the Rangers-Blue Jays game that day, but opted against it after receiving some intel from Rangers manager Bobby Valentine himself that in all likelihood, due to pitching a ton in his last start, Nolan Ryan would not be pitching in this game, and it would be someone else on the mound. ESPN changed the game thinking that they dodged a bullet and that Ryan wouldn't be playing. But then, he not only wound up playing, but put together arguably the greatest pitching performance of his career, as he threw a no-hitter at the age of 44. And I bring this up because amazingly enough, this is not the first time that there has been a massive broadcasting controversy surrounding a no-hitter and ESPN during the early 90s. Seems like a bizarrely common theme, or at the very least, one that shouldn't happen twice in less than a year. Yet, due to blackout rules which you're all too familiar with, ESPN televised a game that they had no business televising. Sort of. And that's where chaos ensued, because ESPN was caught in the middle of a firestorm in the middle of one of the most iconic pitching performances in the history of the Los Angeles Dodgers. Because while you probably know about the iconic no-hitter thrown by Fernando Valenzuela, you probably don't know about the bizarre broadcasting controversy that ensued because of it. Because this is the story behind ESPN, and a bizarre screw-up regarding the broadcast of one of the most iconic games of the entire 1990 season. Before I talk about the screw-up on ESPN, and just what exactly went wrong, we need some context to understand, quite simply, what was happening during this game. It's June 29th, 1990, and we've got a Friday night game on our hands in the National League between the St. Louis Cardinals and the Los Angeles Dodgers. Both of these teams are below 500, with the Cardinals last in the NL East, and the Dodgers a whopping 10 games back of the Cincinnati Reds for first place. So it's not like this was a massive game or a big game with huge implications, because both of these teams were looking like they were toast halfway through the season. However, at least you had the man that you've been watching this whole time, Fernando Valenzuela, on the mound. One of the biggest names in baseball, even if he had fallen off from his peak in the mid-1980s by this point. It had not been a great season for Valenzuela thus far, to say the least. He had a losing record, he had an ERA above 4, and was coming off of one of the worst outings of his career, when in his last start on June 24th against the Cincinnati Reds, in a 10-6 loss, he allowed 10 hits and 8 earned runs. But if there's one thing we know about Valenzuela, it's that at any given moment, he can make magic happen. Heck, despite the rough season, he already had multiple complete game wins under his belt, including a complete game shutout against the Chicago Cubs. So maybe he could do something special under the lights and in front of a national television audience on ESPN. If you were a sports fan who was looking for something on TV on a Friday night in late June, this is what you were watching, no doubt about it. And if you made the decision to tune into this game, yeah, you witnessed something you will never forget. Because of all the iconic moments of Valenzuela's career, from his 6 All-Star appearances, to his Cy Young and Rookie of the Year win in 1981, to just about everything that Fernando Mania entailed, this might have been the most memorable one of them all. In front of over 38,000 fans at Dodger Stadium, Valenzuela pulled off the one thing he had never accomplished in his career before this, something that no Dodger pitcher had done since 1980, and something that no Dodger pitcher had done at home since Bill Singer did it all the way back in 1970 against the Philadelphia Phillies. And that was etch his name into MLB history by throwing a no-hitter. As the Dodgers won 6-0, Valenzuela allowed just 3 base runners, although a 4th got on with an error, and kept a big fat goose egg in the hits column, throwing the 20th no-hitter in Dodgers history. Oddly enough, this was not even the only no-hitter of the day, as earlier in the day, Oakland A's pitcher Dave Stewart no-hit the Toronto Blue Jays, making this the first time since 1898 and the first time in the World Series era that 2 no-hitters were thrown on the same day. Just another reason to remember this incredible performance. Valenzuela was firing on all cylinders, to say the least. As to say that he bounced back from that awful outing last time out against the Reds would be an understatement. He struck out 7 batters. He only threw 119 pitches, or just over 13 pitches per inning, making relatively quick work of his batters. And this was no slouch of an offense that Valenzuela was dealing with. The first 3 guys in the order were Vince Coleman, Willie McGee, and Pedro Guerrero, all 3 of whom were All-Stars in either 1988 or 1989, so they were some of the best players in baseball. No problem though. Valenzuela retired 17 straight batters at one point, and got Coleman, who made the All-Star game in back-to-back years and was one of the most feared base runners in the National League, having led the league in stolen bases in each of his first 5 seasons with 472, to strike out 3 times. He looked lost at the plate. In other words, it was a masterful performance by Valenzuela that was the best of his career, and his performance that more than 30 years later is still talked about and is fondly remembered in his legendary career. Having said that, it was not a great night for St. Louis, and not just because they watched their team get no hit, losing yet another game in what was becoming a dismal season for the team. Rather, it was because of a little something called blackout rules. You're probably familiar with these rules, even if you don't recognize it. If you've ever seen advertisements on ESPN for your team playing on Wednesday Night Baseball or something like that, and then you watch SportsCenter as the lead-in program, and the next thing that airs is another SportsCenter or ESPN News, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not super complicated. Barring exceptions like Sunday Night Baseball, your home market team will never play on ESPN. Even if they're scheduled to play on ESPN, that's for the rest of the country, not for you. You can still watch the game, as you can watch it on your local station with your local broadcasters and crew, but it won't be on ESPN, as they won't steal a game from your local crew. This means that if, for instance, the Mets were playing on Wednesday Night Baseball, and you lived in New York, and you had a friend who lived in California, you would both be able to watch the game. However, you would have 2 completely different broadcasting experiences and 2 different ways to watch. While your friend in California would watch the Mets on ESPN, you'd have to watch the game on the local station, which in this case is SNY. You might have even noticed that this broadcast of the no-hitter and the game you've been watching is not an ESPN presentation. Rather, it's a local presentation from Los Angeles. And that's exactly why. So you would think that this should be a clear-cut, no-brainer decision, right? If you were in St. Louis, you could watch the game on KPLR, otherwise known as Channel 11. You couldn't watch it on ESPN. If you turned on ESPN, you would get the American League battle between the Milwaukee Brewers and the Seattle Mariners. Seems like you can't possibly mess this up. Cardinals game on the local station, and ESPN showing a different game because the Cards game was blacked out there. Heck, if you flipped open the newspaper and saw what was on the docket and what was on TV, you would see that this was the game plan quite clearly. Cardinals at Dodgers on KPLR, and Brewers at Mariners on ESPN. Easy peasy and a complete non-story. This is the easiest and oldest blackout rule in the book, and this should be a complete non-issue. Well, that's where you'd be wrong. Very, very wrong. If this was smooth sailing, then this is a complete non-story, and I've got nothing to talk about. But for some reason, the people running the ESPN telecast at KenCom, the largest cable company in St. Louis at the time that served more than 550,000 people in the area, didn't broadcast the Mariners-Brewers game. You wanted to watch that at 9:30 Central? Too bad. You're watching the Cardinals-Dodgers game that ESPN, locally speaking, was explicitly not allowed to show and not allowed to televise. So now, you've got a gigantic problem on your hands. You've got Brewers fans and Mariner fans in St. Louis angry and upset that they've been lied to because they can't watch the game that they were promised. And let's be honest, this is one of the few times they would get a chance to see their team play on TV, seeing as neither of these teams were any good or had large national fan bases to the point where they would be on TV a lot. You got television executives upset and advertisers with KPLR upset because their audience was being cannibalized by ESPN when they weren't allowed to televise this game in the first place. And you've got baseball fans upset because instead of being able to flip back and forth between the two games, they only had one game available at their disposal. In other words, it was a giant mess. And it was about to get a heck of a lot worse. Because eventually, KenCom caught the mistake and realized that they were not supposed to be showing this game. Whether they realized it on their own accord, or someone phoned in angrily, I'm not sure. But seeing as they should have known the rules this late into the season, and seeing as it was advertised in the papers that Cardinals-Dodgers would not be on ESPN, I highly doubt that they recognized this themselves. But once the mistake was caught and identified, they did the one thing that ticked off just about everyone. They flipped off the game. That's right, they turned the game off midway through, and switched it to something else. As Vice President John Clark said on this, it was due to a combination of human error and a problem with the ESPN deauthorization procedure. Once we became aware of the problem, we shifted over manually. And now, you managed to tick off the one group that wasn't ticked off before. The fans of the Cardinals and the Dodgers. Because a lot of those viewers had no idea that the game was still being shown by the other network, and was being shown by KPLR. So they just assumed that the game went dark and there were technical difficulties, and they couldn't watch the end of the no-hitter. Any viewers that watched the game and assumed like a sane person that ESPN would stick with it the whole way through, and decided to video record it, were in for quite a rude awakening when halfway through the tape, it showed a completely different game. Any people that got ESPN but didn't get KPLR for whatever reason were also screwed. In other words, at least in St. Louis, because of terrible communication, this was one of the baseball versions of the Heidi game, which I've talked about at length on my football channel, so you can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. This broadcast should have been smooth sailing for ESPN and KenCom, and television executives and viewers in St. Louis. Instead, it turned into a complete disaster, and on a historic night nonetheless. The Fernando Valenzuela no-hitter still lives on more than 3 decades later, for being one of the most iconic pitching performances in one of the most iconic careers in the history of the Los Angeles Dodgers and in the history of Major League Baseball. But for those on the losing side who watched it, or tried to watch it, it still lives on for being an amazing display of incompetence and an unbelievable broadcasting disaster. Whoever you want to place the blame on here is up to you. But one thing is clear. On the night of June 29, 1990, despite getting no hit, the Cardinals were the only organization in St. Louis that lost in a big-time way.
Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated.
See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.